Hello again. I'm back. This time we're going to talk about Deadhouse Gates, the second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Stephen Erickson. I'm Dr. Goodwyn. I'm a fantasy author and also psychiatrist. I like to take a look at fantasy narratives from the point of view of the psyche and also how it impacts things like culture and the way that we think about history and ourselves and archetypes and all kinds of cool stuff. So if you're into that, stick around. So what's going on here? In the Deadhouse Gates, we have a continuation of the story from the first book, Gardens of the Moon. However, we're on a different continent. Although a few of the bridge burners do return from book one. And as it turns out, interestingly enough, all the stuff going on in this book is going on simultaneously with the plot of book three. So there's a little confusing there if you're new to this series. There is actually a kind of an interesting story behind that. Turns out that when Erickson was working on the series, he wrote book three first, chronologically, but then lost it all in what must have been horrific, nightmarish event of memory loss on one of the computers that he was using. So you got to commend the guy. He went on to write the next one, but then the publisher wanted the sequel to be, moving along, and so he went ahead, wrote that one. It became the second one, and he adjusted it to book three to go ahead and be after this one, if that makes sense. So they were flipped chronologically initially, but then he worked it to where, because of this memory accident, he switched it around to the current order of operations. So what that means, though, is that books two and three actually comprise something of a coherent whole. Now, that's within the greater narrative that's developing across all of the series. So what's going on this time? So in this book, we have 7 cities. We're back to 7 cities partially. It is engulfed in a rebellion a little bit after the events of book one. And what we have is the Raraku Desert, where a great whirlwind is building up, led by this mysterious goddess. And they're fighting against the Malazan Empire. Because the cities of the Malazan Empire are being taken over by the rebels, a daring rescue, if you will, of 50,000 people from the city of Hisar are being escorted to the capital of the empire, which is Aren. And the person in charge of this is Coltane, a legendary Wiccan general of the Crow clan. And the story of that harrowing journey is one of the central pieces of this book. And I'll get a little bit more into that here in a second. Now, as that's happening, there's a bunch of other stuff happening. Kalam, which we remember from book one as the assassin, is out to get revenge against the Empress Lacine. So he goes on his own harrowing journey of sorts. And at the same time that's happening, there's another set of travelers from the continent of Genebacus who arrive in seven cities on their own quests. And all of these sorts of things kind of impact and intersect with each other as they go in the book. As in book one, that doesn't even cover a tiny sliver of the plot that happens here. There is so much stuff going on in this book, as in all of the Malazan books. And, that's kind of a hallmark of the series at this point. And if you got through book one and you liked that style, that's pretty much the same style that's in all of the books that I've read so far. So now the question is, of course, will you like it? Before I get into what I think about it, I want to point out a couple of things about it that will allow you, hopefully, to decide whether or not you want to give this one a try. In terms of plot and pace, as in book one, the pace is quick, it's dense, it's Erickson. He does not hold your hand. He expects you to keep up. There's hardly any characters from Gardens of the Moon in this one. There's a couple, but that's it. And there's a slew of new ones. And in terms of following the plot, I think it is a little bit easier to follow this one than in Gardens of the Moon, but the lack of the returning characters is may be an issue that trips you up some, because you've got to basically start from scratch and relearn a whole new bazillion characters and all the different viewpoints. And yes, there are scattered plot lines that are spread across thousands of miles. They do, as in most epic fantasies of this nature, converge near the end, but the plot convergence is not complete. And part of that is for a very good reason. It's because book 2 and 3, like I said, are tied together. They're very tightly bound. And much of what happens in this book continues directly into the next one. But even in that case, you still have plot lines that continue to develop beyond that, as you would expect. The characters, again, you've got dozens of them. You've got all these different viewpoints. You have plot lines scattered across thousands of miles. Like I said, they do converge at the end for the most part, but it does take a little while to get going. Fans of Brandon Sanderson, the way he does this, I think will like this to a degree. I would say Erikson's plotting style is like Sanderson on steroids. He's got more characters. There's many more places going on, to say, compared to like Way of Kings, for example. There is way more plot happening. He does not dwell very long anywhere. There's always stuff going on. The stakes are relentless. They're very high tension. You hardly ever get a break. And I think to that degree, sometimes the tension is so sustained for so long that it can be a little exhausting for some readers. It may be. I kind of like that ultra high tension approach, but I do understand and respect the observation that it might be nice to have a break from some of that every once in a while. Now, it's not to say there aren't any. There's some humorous moments. There's some really zany characters like you had in the first book that are just completely over the top and wackadoodle. And so that does give you a little bit of a release from the extremely high tension elements that's going on elsewhere. But for the most part, the tone is bam, bam, bam. It's constantly hitting you with new dangers, attack from all sides, you name it. Speaking of the tone, again, we're back into a military fantasy situation, and it's even more so this time. In particular, the plot I mentioned earlier about the long exodus of 1,500 miles from a city that had been taken over by enemies to the capital city is so intense, and it has its own name. It's called the Chain of Dogs. And it becomes a legend within the story, but also kind of outside the story. The people that are familiar with the series, everybody knows what you mean when you're talking about the Chain of Dogs. It's the highlight of this book. It's one plot line, and it's a major, major plot line. It's a very central feature of this story. You will not forget it. It's inspired very heavily by real world events. Erikson has said that he drew inspiration from the Trail of Tears, from the flight of the Nez Perce tribe, and there's several other historical events that are very similar to this, where you've got a group of people that are very poorly armed. They're, in a lot of ways, they're very vulnerable and helpless, and they've got to run this horrendous gauntlet to get to safety. It's extremely intense. I will advise readers to be aware of that. It's not for the faint of heart. Erikson obviously studied real-world costs of war and how bleak and awful it can get, and he does not shy away from any of it. Imagery, in terms of like description, on the Sando Peak scale, again, he hovers right around the 4 to 5 range. I think some may find it difficult to follow this one, though, because, again, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time orienting you. At the beginning of a brand new character with a brand new viewpoint, you could be thousands of miles away from what you were just reading 2 paragraphs ago, and he doesn't make a lot of noise about it. You got to make sure you're paying attention, or else you're going to get lost. You're like, wait a minute, where are we? What are we doing here? Who is this? What do they want? Why? Who's against them? What's going on? So that happens, and this is just kind of the way Erikson rolls. So if you don't like that, you may not be super into this book. Again, we're covering thousands of miles, so it can be a bit of a blur. There are later books in the series he doesn't do this quite as much, and he doesn't do it quite as much in Gardens of the Moon. But here, and he's got his reasons for doing this, of course. I think Erickson he knows exactly what he's doing, and he understands the so-called rules of storytelling and when to break them. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily a drawback at all. It's just I'm saying this is a point of contention that you may have, and you may if not, great. Again, the relentless pace and the action is very continuous. You may even consider the constant state of disorientation as something of a benefit. I actually I think that is one of the parts that's kind of fun about the series is that because and I got the same effect from Dune because you don't necessarily know what in the world's going on when you get dropped into the middle of the action. Part of the fun is kind of trying to figure out, well, where am I? Who are these people? What's going on? And that kind of draws you. It can draw you in. For other readers, though, wow, that is just super disorienting. Pulls them out of the narrative. They have a hard time connecting with the characters, and I get that. That's how it works. Magic. Okay, as before, magic is super powerful, but not explained in much detail, and that's okay. You just sort of go with it, which I didn't mind that at all. There is, I think, relatively less of it here, at least in terms of mages and like spells being cast, but you have, on the other hand, even more of it with weird monsters and bizarre creatures and the traveling through these extra dimensional warrens where magic comes from, but they're also a place. Wizards open them up to draw power from them, but you can also travel to them and through them into other places, and there's all kinds of crap going on in these warrens as well. So if you're like me, I absolutely love that. I love how just bizarre and weird and just totally, you never know what in the world's going to happen when a warren gets opened up and you get chucked into there and who knows. So I like that. And that dimension to this story is, there's a little bit more of that in this one than in book one. So what about my take in terms of story and psyche? All of these books have a heavy allegorical bent to them, I think. Deadhouse Gates is possibly the most of the ones I've read so far, especially when it comes to the Chain of Dogs. That storyline is such an event that it qualifies more as, I think, an allegorical story depicting several of the realities of human existence, such as warfare, cruelty, suffering, sacrifice, and duty in a way which will be very difficult for you to forget. The impact of a story is only partially from a book. The rest of it comes from you, the reader. So in crafting a harrowing journey like this, but in more abstract fantasy terms, as Erickson does, guides us through essentially a very brutal and traumatizing journey. But because we're reading it and because it's in fantasy, it's not quite as harrowing as going through the real thing would be. So the effect can be potentially to actually increase resilience or maybe even heighten compassion, perhaps shy away from the dark realities of war and have a bit of a visceral response when that sort of thing emerges in the so-called real world. Whether or not that's good or bad depends on the reader, I think. It could probably be overwhelming for quite a few readers. As a symbolic statement, it's a nightmare that says war creates situations like the Chain of Dogs. And now, if you've read it, then you have such a vivid picture of how awful that is. I wouldn't say it's as grimdark. I debated about that for a while, and that's one of those nebulous categories anyway. But I don't think it is because it's not nihilistic. In other words, it doesn't have you run through this horrible stuff and say, and also all of that stuff that you went through was utterly pointless. Rather, there is a more tragic dimension in the classic sense, meaning that the tragedy expresses a deeper truth or theme that emerges from the experience of the tragic events. So it's not so much that you get a theme that is spelled out through the arcs of the characters or the outcomes of the characters, but rather their actions despite the horrible outcomes, or the actions of the more evil and twisted and confused characters, the value and the meaning, the higher and more transcendent meaning, comes from seeing how what they should have done and what they didn't do played out. And so you get it kind of in reverse. You get in the negative, I would say. The meaning comes from what they didn't do. Rather than, say, in a nihilistic narrative, which would basically present the argument that it didn't make any difference what they did, because nothing means anything anyway, and it's all completely absurd and pointless. That's not really the theme. That's not the vibe that this book gives me, and none of the others do either. Even though they are quite dark sometimes and grueling and gory and all of that stuff. So, my take. This one I didn't enjoy quite as much as Gardens of the Moon. I gave that one 5 out of 5 Dreamstones. This one gets 4 out of 5. And I might have given it even less than that because I struggled with the jumping around across thousands of miles with all these new characters that I don't know anything about, many of whom weren't quite as, I think, compelling, at least to me, as the ones in the first one. Nevertheless, it gained an additional boost of one Dreamstone to give it a 4 out of 5 because the Chain of Dogs piece of this story is just so incredibly good. It's so moving. It's so powerful. It's grueling. It deserved every bit of that. So that's my take. And again, a lot of that's just my own personal preferences, and it's a me problem rather rather than the book's problem. Um, and so that's where I stand on that one. So that's what I've got. I will review the rest of these books as I go. I've just finished book 6, and now I'm on to book 7. And in any case, be sure to check out my own new adult fantasy novel, King of the Forgotten Darkness. It's available now. The link is below in the description. And go ahead and check that out. See if that might be something of interest to you. And in the meantime, keep dreaming, keep going into the fantasy realms, and I will see you next time.